Therefore, the radio station itself retains political neutrality, and any political views or comments aired as part of political discussion programming or otherwise are not the views of Listen Lanarkshire, nor of Getting Better Together Limited. The station has a set of key commitments found on the Ofcom website, and we adhere to all necessary Ofcom rules. For more information or inquiries, please contact us at radio@shotshealthyliving.com.
Hello and welcome to What's the Point, the show where we stir the pot, name the ingredients and occasionally get banned for the kitchen. I'm your host, Greg Lennon, community campaigner, part-time political nuisance, full-time fan of due process and proudly the Labour group's Lord Provost #1 pen pal. If there's a motion gone missing, a contract going sideways or a briefing that's mysteriously vanished, there's a decent chance I've already asked the monitoring officer for it in writing. Twice, Jerry. Joining me tonight, as always, the people's champion of constitutional chaos, Mr. Jerry Brennan, the Bellsy Hill bowler, can't even get my words right, community organiser, defender of local democracy. How are you, Jerry?
Greg, I'm splendid tonight, and as always, it's an extraordinary pleasure to be here.
Well, Jerry, let me tell you, our guest tonight needs absolutely no introduction, but we're giving you one anyway. Jamie Kerr is one of Scotland's leading immigration lawyers, a former Labour candidate, seasoned political operator, and a man with one foot in the courtroom and the other in the political war zone. He's seen how the system works and how it doesn't. We'll be asking him about party power, democracy in decline, immigration rhetoric versus reality, and maybe, just maybe, there's still a point left about politics. So get comfy, charge your phone, and if you hear something that makes you gasp, don't worry, we've probably already been reported. You're listening to Listen Lanarkshire 107.7 FM, and if you miss it, the podcast drops on Thursday wherever you get your podcasts from. Let's get into it, Jerry. What's the point?
What is the point? So the point tonight is that we have one of the most influential immigration lawyers in Scotland, and as we always do with guests, Jamie, we try and find out as much about you as we possibly can. So tell us a wee bit about you, how you started out. You can speak obviously about your political career and how that crosses over into the political.
Well, it's going to be a long hour for your listeners if they listen to me talk about myself.
Regretting coming already, Jerry. He's regretting coming.
So what is it to know? I grew up in Blackwood, in Lanarkshire, went to school in Hamilton, and then went off to university in Glasgow, and then off to Edinburgh to train to be a lawyer.
So are you a grammar boy or a Holy Cross boy?
Holy Cross.
You're a Holy Cross boy.
Holy Cross, famous for Paul McStay and probably not very much
my
else.
friend was his current head teacher.
Was it?
Well, she is, yeah, so Holy Cross.
I once went back, as a side note, I once went back to Holy Cross to judge a debate when I worked in Edinburgh for the Law Society. They were doing a school debating competition. Right. And I got to the school and had to phone my mum and say, where's the school? I'm outside a Lidl. So, yeah, I hadn't realised years ago that the school had moved, so I've not been back for a long time. But yeah, so I work as a lawyer now. I'm the first lawyer in the family. My sister's a lawyer, my cousin's a lawyer, so we went from having no lawyers to having a bunch of us in the family. My background was quite normal, I suppose. Growing up, my mum was a housekeeper in hotels, my dad was a window cleaner, so the legal world was something that was maybe known to some elements of the family, but not on the same side of the court that I tend to sit in these days. But the law's been very good to me over the years. You say what you want about the profession, but I genuinely think it is a bit of a meritocracy. If you're good, you can go far. And you see that among some of the judges as well. You wouldn't think it, but some of them have got to where they are through hard work.
Do you think it's the same for politicians, Jamie? Be honest.
I think it used to be.
We had Hannah Roger on last week, and that was her parting shot in relation to the show is that politicians now, they don't come with any life experience. They seem to just be picked or plucked out the air, and then that's it. And it's really about mind thyself rather than looking to try and make life better for larger groups of people. It's more about trying to protect their own.
I think that's a real problem in politics now. I don't want to say it to politicians, it's quality of politicians.
Well, listen, our quality standards are low, I tell you.
we'd probably agree with that. And I think one of the things we spoke to Hannah about, and I'm eating into your time here, is that we believe that people should be coming into politics with at least some life experience to back them up through the world of work, or having accrued at least some kind of life experience. And there's too many who sadly don't.
The argument in it is as well, Jerry, is the fact that it used to be a broad church politics, so we would have people like yourself who've retired and they're entering into politics because that's the new era of their career or whatever it may be. So you had that representation, whereas now it just seems a sort of free-for-all within the party political system, because everybody thinks, whether rightly or wrongly, that they're capable of becoming an MP or an MSP or a councillor.
The robots.
Yeah, the robots, as Hannah said.
Yeah, and I think that's a challenge, because I don't think, I suppose in the old days there was maybe too many lawyers in politics, but if you think back to the 80s, some of the lawyers around politics had been representing people in very serious cases in court. You had business people in politics, whereas I would agree now that most people's backgrounds in politics are simply within the parties, just doing what they're told. I think even gone is the trade unionist who's represented employees in front of the bosses for years. That's even gone.
Where do you think they go? Because they have to go somewhere. They still exist, but where do you think they go? Those ones who were high up in the unions, who would naturally have just moved on.
Probably on the golf course. But they're certainly not around politics.
They're not.
And I've moved parties, as you know, and they're not in any. They're not in either party anymore. But I think that's a great loss as well to society more broadly.
I agree. Yeah. Have you always had your interest in the law? Has it always been around immigration, or have you specialised in other areas?
No, I'm a one-trick pony, as it were. I've always done immigration. I fell into immigration when I was really young, just through chance. I'd done a placement whilst at university in a law centre, dealing with asylum seekers and refugees. And I loved immigration because I love politics. And immigration was quite political, to the extent that you were dealing with people who were often political activists in their home countries. You were learning about their countries, about what's happened to them. So I fell into immigration law that way. And back then, I genuinely wanted to be helping people. And in immigration, it was an easy way to be making a difference, fighting against the odds, against the system, winning cases. So
how do you think that's changed now? Do you see such a dramatic change or flux within the system now, or is it still the same?
No, I think a lot's changed. My career's changed as well, so now I'm not doing asylum seekers and refugees. I started doing that, done human rights law for a long time, then started to deal with small businesses, helping them bring in staffs, nursing homes, care homes, hotels, and then gradually moved up. Now my clients are more big corporate businesses. I do sports clubs, energy companies bringing in skilled staff. So my career's changed over the years. I think being on the front line working for asylum seekers and refugees is a really hard gig at the moment. It was always hard, but it's harder now, and with the way the justice system is, it's probably even harder.
Is it harder for the immigrant to remain, or is the law static? Has the law been static around that, or have there been changes that make it more difficult for those entering the country? For example, those coming in seeking asylum.
I think the full system's just a roller coaster. When I was doing it in volume, the real challenge was delays in the system. The system's broken. The system doesn't work. And no matter what side of the political argument on that's a consensus.
That's a theme across the board, and we'll touch on that as we go on.
Well, the immigration, my own view would be the justice system's broke, the health system broke, the country's basically broken, but the immigration system is broken, and when I was on the front line, it was significant delays in the system that caused chaos, and there was a lack of enforcement in the system. So some countries, some nationalities, you would maybe lose the case, but you know that nobody's going anywhere, and the system became quite circular as well. I think the system now is swifter than it was before, but it still doesn't operate because the public bodies, the Home Office, don't make the right decisions in the first place. There's no clear consensus. There's cases where you think, well, this should be winning.
Yeah.
Why am I constantly having to appeal this? And there's other cases where you think, well, this should never be winning.
So just for a better understanding for me, right now we're in a political landscape where, in my opinion, and before you correct me, that post-truth politics that exists, and again where we are is we're seeing the rise of the right's utilising the idea of the small boats and elements where, let's no kid on about it, it's been highly contested in relation to England, and that's their messaging that's resonating. But in Scotland, obviously given last week's by-election, we're seeing that Reform's having a significant input in Scottish politics now, and Farage and others are coming up and quite happy to be part of that. Where do you see the political landscape change in Scotland now? Because that idea of small boats, does it really affect Scotland in our opinion? No, really. We don't really see the impact it probably as much as what we do down south. But where do you see that?
So I think in Scotland we have a exceptionalism where we think that we're different.
Yeah.
But I think the attitudes on things like migration are not that far off what they are in England. And then if you look at the perception towards migration across all of Europe, and in the US, it's the same theme across the board. So we don't have small boats landing on the beaches in Scotland, but we see the impact of migration in Scotland. And I think in my experience, I do a lot of talks on migration sessions, and I'll often start by asking people to raise a hand and say, who thinks we should have tighter immigration controls? And most people will say, yes, we should. But then you start to take them through examples, saying, well, this guy's a doctor, should he be allowed to be here? Yes, he should. This woman's a care worker, should she be allowed to be here? So I think what the public want is migration that's planned and controlled. And I think the perception of the system is that it's uncontrolled. And that's a narrative of, I suppose, the right, as you put it.
I have family who live in New Zealand, and I also have friends who live in Australia, and the Australian model is often held up as the gold standard, if you like, in as much as it's what you can bring to Australia rather than what Australia can offer you. Is that something that you think the UK should be looking to move towards? I'm not trying to push you down a particular road. If you don't want to answer that, that's fine. I would totally understand that.
My own view is that we need to separate out the strands of immigration. So we just talk about immigration, whereas you have asylum, which is international protection, protecting people in war zones, and then you have immigration, which is essentially linked to the economy, or it ought to be linked to the economy. So where I see the system ought to be is that businesses should be able to access labour where there are chronic skill shortages and they can't get the skills here. Maybe we can have a tighter approach to immigration for sectors where there's already labour here. So it has to be tied to the labour market. And I don't think, even if you take Reform, for instance, and what they're saying, they're not saying any different from that in terms of Scotland. They're saying, well, I think in their pledge or the promise or whatever they call it, they say where the care sector needs workers from abroad, we should be able to bring them from abroad. But I think for too long, migration, others have viewed that migration kind of holds back from investment, it holds back from automation, AI. So some on the right would say a car wash. It's a classic example. So 20 years ago, a car wash was a machine. Never quite wash a car properly. But now a car wash is not a machine, it's kind of some very low-skilled guys washing the car. But no one's invested in the machines anymore because they have access to labour from overseas. And I think it was Theresa May who said some sectors, some industries are simply addicted to overseas labour. So I think in terms of the full-scale debate on migration, we have to split out our obligations under international law to people who need help, asylum, refugees, and where labour fits in the economy, to make sure that businesses are incentivised to train, to offer apprenticeships, and to make their sectors more attractive to
Do you think that's been clearly marked out by political parties within the rhetoric? Do you think that's something that's needing more of? We need to highlight these differences.
No, I don't think many of the political parties highlight the distinction on the two. And I think if they did highlight the distinction more, the public would understand better what migration is needed and what migration ought to be controlled. control more.
So that kind of leads me into a question. I know you want to come in there now, but I'm still on this train of thought.
The man's not even had a chance to speak about his politics yet, Greg.
Well, I'm trying to.
Always working.
Fascinating subject matter. It's absolutely fascinating because, really, in effect, we can boldly go into conjecture about our viewpoints on a weekly basis, but here we have an expert in the subject matter. So I'm wanting schooled on this, Jamie. I'll be honest with you. So given then the fact that you have the potential politicians utilising this subject matter, whether rightly or wrongly, it's not for me to judge that, but the position here would be if they're using that as part of the rhetoric to gain boost votes and that kind of thing, then we look at the other extreme with John Swinney. As soon as reform comes into play in relation to anything at all in Scotland, it was the emergency crisis meeting in regards to bringing everybody together to stop this kind of conversation, this kind of debate. In the grander scheme of things in politics, do you think that's the wrong messaging as well in relation to that? Because if it's the case that people want to talk about migration, they should have the discourse and the position to be able to talk about it, rather than looking at it as the boogeyman kind of idea.
And I think this sums up where we are in politics. The reality is people are speaking about migration and immigration and their views on it one way or another, and whether they're deemed by the political establishment to be proper views or not, people are speaking about it. And I think where I see reform having captured people's imagination is that they're having the same conversation that has somehow become taboo amongst the kind of the other political parties. So I don't think that we, as a lawyer, we debate, we argue, and this concept of no platforming or refusing to debate with people who oppose you is kind of alien to my way of thinking, because if you have a view that you disagree with, you have to engage with it openly, rightly or wrongly. And I think where reform aren't capturing people's imaginations is because they're saying this, they're talking about the same topics that people on the street are talking about. And I think the other parties are presenting migration, I think, as black and white. It's either good or it's bad. Whereas the reality is it's much more nuanced. And the public knows is nuanced. So people who say we need to stop the small boats and there's too much immigration will also say, I don't care where the doctor's from as long as the doctor sees me. Who cares where the doctor's from? So the public's debate is nuanced, and I think mainstream politics, as we know it, is alienating themselves. The political elite are in the bubble, all sharing the same consensus views, not listening to what the people on the street are talking about. And reform have moved. I think we saw that last week with the reception that the leader got.
The point that you made there about creating this boogeyman emergency, and it's the first time I've seen the SNP use that style of ad.
They tried to create it with Boris Johnson, if you remember, but it was the buffoon idea, but it never went to the extreme exclusion.
I would agree with that, and I think you're right to highlight that, because I think that approach absolutely backfired, and they got away from the bread and the butter issues, which is rattling on your doors, knowing where your votes are, and rattling on the doors. And the big thing I took from last week, as well as the kind of approach that the SNP took by ignoring Labour, focusing solely on reform, creating this, I don't want to call it a straw man, right? But they created this approach around reform that was malevolent almost, and they forgot to chap doors, while Labour just went round something like 8,000 doors on one day.
Well, that's
so they said.
I don't know if that's an accurate figure, although they're reporting it, but my goodness.
But when you go on the doors, when we were, and I've said this before, when we were on the doors, especially in Hart Hill, when we fought the Fertisset by-election, in some pockets of North Lanarkshire, on the door, where it's not immediately evident to me that there's a change in the colour of the people who are living and working there, but they still perceive there to be a problem with migration. And the question I was going to ask you was, is there a problem? Because I looked at the national records for Scotland, records that they produced, and the last meaningful records that they have are from 2023. They've not really been updated. But when you look at the figures from, and this is kind of net migration, the number of Scots who leave and the number of new people who come back in, between 2023, it's like 520,000 over, almost 25 years. They're not big. That's not big figures. I mean, it's not a catastrophic change that would. It's not like New Zealand where you've got exponential growth where the population's almost doubled in 30 years. This is relatively small increases, and yet it's perceived to be a crisis, an emergency.
I think the point about immigration has always been that it's generally concentrated in certain areas, and I think that's sometimes a challenge. So you go back to the Irish went to an area, the Jews went to an area, the Lithuanians went to an area. So over time, there's always been a kind of concentration of migrants. In Scotland, is it a problem? I personally wouldn't say it's a problem as such, but I think there's a problem with how immigration is perceived, rightly or wrongly. And I also think that there are challenges around migration. Undoubtedly, there's always been challenges around migration that the political parties refuse to discuss or talk about, the issues around integration and the like. And I think a lot of our narrative, we see the pressure on some of the local authorities in the south of England, and that narrative's been picked up here. I don't think it's necessarily here. Yeah, but even with asylum, so if you look at the asylum seekers who have come since maybe the mid 1990s or so, they were generally concentrated into certain local authorities that agreed to take them. So immigration in those areas was much more visible than it would be maybe say here in North Lanarkshire or over in South Lanarkshire. But I think how do we deal with immigration? I think we've got to start off by understanding it's a complex area and it's not just one strand, because there's family migration as well, business migration, student migration, but it's all lumped together and the debate is not as nuanced as it ought to be, and it's been made a taboo subject that cannot be spoken about, and that's no good for anyone. It's never good for anyone, any topic.
So within your career, you've built quite a significant career over the years based on immigration. What would you say is the biggest misconceptions that you tend to come across?
What's the biggest misconceptions? Probably, if I'm being honest, to say, if we think about the asylum refugee side, the biggest misconception is say everyone is at it. There might be people who are not genuine asylum seekers, but not everyone. There are people from war zones who have been tortured, who are persecuted, and we have an international obligation to help them. How we do it is interesting, because if you look at there's two examples of how we've done it very differently. Kosovo in the late 90s, and then Ukraine recently. So we helped people who were from war zones, who were facing persecution, and we accepted them, and civic society rose to the challenge, as it were, on both of them.
There's a moral judgment made there. Like the individuals fleeing Kosovo, the individuals fleeing Ukraine were coming, as the public would perceive it to be, through no fault of their own. And if you contrast that, I was speaking to an immigration and asylum worker last week, and I was asking him, from his perspective, similar to the question I was asking you, is there a problem? And he said, well, there genuinely is, and it tends to be from one area in particular, and that is the Eastern European country now escapes me. You might be able to correct me.
I don't want to say Albania.
No.
Albania.
No, Albania. That's exactly what was. And I asked the numbers, and they say that over the last few months there's been around 15,000 young, economically active males have reached the UK shores, and they come on boats, but not the boats that you and I would think of leaving from Calais or northern France and crossing the Channel. They're going through the Schengen area. They're going into Dublin, and they're going up into the UK through the north of Ireland and into the UK that way.
Yeah, I think I think with certain nationalities there are challenges around migration, illegal migration, and it's hard to figure out why that is. Yeah. The Schengen area, the kind of people crossing across Europe. The theory is on asylum refugee work is that you should be claiming asylum in the first safe country, and very rarely is the UK the first safe country that people arrive at. But
is that enshrined in law though? Because I've heard commentators speak about that as being a trope, almost. That notion of the first safe place has to be the place where you stop rather than carrying on.
Yeah, so
is it the case?
It is enshrined that you should be claiming in the first safe country you come to, or the first safe country where it's reasonably practical for you to claim. But often what people will say, well, I was in the hands of the smugglers and only knew where I was when I was found myself in Cali or Dover or somewhere. But that side of things is complicated, because I think what we need to bear in mind, and one of the faults in the system, is that people can only claim asylum when they're in the UK. So they have to get here one way or another. In some countries you can claim abroad or be processed abroad, but Britain's never done that. And therefore, for people who are genuinely in need, there's no way into the country for them. And one of the problems that they have is that they're lost amongst lots of people who are perhaps economic migrants.
So Scotland's, I'm going to try and kind of stay on the subject matter, Jimmy. Scotland's demographic future relies on migration, and that's one of the critical points that I think we're all recognised. Is the current system working? And if it isn't, and it was a devolved matter, how would you change it? And what would you think needs to change within it?
So I'm going to be a lawyer and shift your starting premise there, because the Scottish government do repeatedly, they always say Scotland's demographic future is based on migration. Now, migration should probably have a role to play in it, but I think there's broader reasons as to, well, why are we in a demographic decline in the first place, and what can we do to reverse that. But again, this is an area where we won't have a proper broader debate, because one of the few countries to reverse that decline is Hungary, and people don't like the leader of Hungary, people don't like his politics, but the Hungarian government have encouraged people to have more children, for instance. So they've tried to, they are very tough on immigration, but they have tried to address their demographic decline in other ways, by having tax incentives for people to have more children, by offering nursery places, for instance, for families. I think they do discounts on cars or something like that. But there's a million other ways. But we don't even look at any of that. We wouldn't even talk about any of that. We'd view all that as wacky in Scotland.
Being family friendly is wacky. Is that kind of where we're at?
Well, that would be my perception of how it's perceived. Essentially, that in some way,
Poland have adopted a similar approach. I know they're not quite as far advanced as Hungary is, but it seems to be that in that Eastern European sort of bloc, they seem more inclined to revert back to the family and having kids.
Scandinavia's exactly the same as well. You got up to Denmark and Sweden, it's more focused on family and encouraging people to have children. But whether or not, I don't know what the demographic shift is in that. But
I think a lot of it is the perception. The perception, if you are family oriented, is that you are right wing, and I think that is part of the political narrative that has crept into UK politics and Scottish politics as well.
But the leader in Hungary is firmly on the right, and he's pushing this and and therefore we can't have a sense of the body. I think the left-right thing in politics is kind of gone, but we still talk about it. So we say actually him giving tax, and I think I'm right in saying, you need to check this, but I think I'm right in saying that once a family has a fourth child, the family unit don't pay income tax again after that. So it's a very radical incentive
Indeed it is.
You look at the challenges here of having children and trying to work. We've got 2 kids. It's hard enough with 2, but
it's a breeze.
But,
Jamie.
Wait till you get to 3 and 4. I was going to say.
But I think so. We focus on migration. We say population and migration, and we disregard any other measures to address why we have population decline.
It's fascinating as this is, and I'm sure we could all talk about this all night, but there's also another part that we want to get to Jamie on, and because he's a guest, and your political involvement in North Lanarkshire, Jamie. So, as you've kind of hinted towards earlier, you've stood as a Labour Party candidate for Shetland Islands, I think it was, as an MP.
Shetland,
And again, the thing that we're fascinated with is internal party selection. So we're not going to ask you any sort of direct questions in case it's a wee bit uncomfortable. But we always like to talk about the SNP's internal selection process.
That's only one we know.
We'll use this as an opportunity tonight to start talking about Labour Party's internal selection processes. Being a person who's obviously been politically motivated, how do you feel the difference between parties? What do you think the main difference between Labour and the SNP has been, and why did you kind of go in the avenues you went?
My view on that's changed over the years, I think. So I was very active in the Labour Party.
Yeah.
And as a young lawyer, I was very active. I ran for Labour in Shetland. Interestingly, I found out how politics works in that election. It's kind of put me off, I suppose, because I went in to tell my managing partner at the law firm that I'd been selected, and he said, "Well, which party?" And I said, "Labour." And he said, "Well, that's good, because we acted for one of the trade unions at the time." He said, they won't mind. And and then he said, "What seat?" And I said, "Shetland." And he said, "Well, I thought you were going to say Shettleston there." And I said, "No, if I'd been selected for Labour in Shettleston, I'd be handing in my notice. But Shetland, I just need a couple of weeks off to go and campaign." But interestingly, had I been selected for Shettleston, I would have handed in my notice, but Labour didn't win Shettleston that time. It showed me the volatility of politics. I would have been
John Mason's seat.
I would have been at the end of that election with no job. But the Labour Party were looking for candidates, and I think in Shetland back then they were used to just putting up a paper candidate, and no one really thought. So it was the Scottish Parliament, and I ran against Tavish Scott, who was the leader of the Lib Dems. And he was a gentleman. He was nice. We announced that Lena was pregnant. My wife was pregnant, and that in that campaign, and someone wrote into the paper and said I was some sort of Machiavelli because I'd planned a pregnancy to announce in the middle of the campaign. But the Labour Party didn't have candidates there, and they asked if I would go up, and I took the view that I'd go up, I'd run the seat, I'd make all the mistakes I had to make, and then when it came to the real deal,
perfect your craft.
I knew what I was doing. But I think it was great fun. I enjoyed it a lot. But then I went back to the law, went back to my work, and then never sought selection for a seat after that experience. But in the Labour Party back then, it was very hard to get a seat. I probably in Scotland go as far to say that seats were handed down to people. It wasn't about talent, really. I don't know to what extent that's still true.
I'm surprised that you say that, having watched the Hamilton, Stonehouse and Larkhall by-election, that you would even dare to suggest that the selection process doesn't include a talent measurement.
I thought when I moved to the SNP, so I came out for independence in 2014 in that campaign, but then I stayed in the Labour Party for quite a while after that, and then I ended up having to leave.
Would you have stayed if Labour had adopted an approach that was welcoming to Scottish independence if and when there was a time where the electorate sought it? Would you have stayed?
Yeah, I probably would have stayed. My views have probably changed much more now, I must say, because I think that seemed to be the time for independence. I think it's past now, and I genuinely don't see it coming back.
I think it's difficult to see it, especially when election campaigns such as the Hamilton by-election, there's not even a mention of independence in there. So for the main political party that's meant to be there to drive the movement and drive everything else, well, they're afraid to mention it now when it comes to elections.
I think now I'd be much more firmer on wanting to know, well, what is the economic case? Who's going to be running the country? In what direction are we are we going in?
We had Kenny McCaskill on a couple of weeks ago, and
He was a great
Kenny's still invigorated in relation to the independence movement and want to take it the full road in relation to Alba for both one vote SNP, second vote Alba. But the position here is you're looking at it, the SNP for me, I think, has lost any sort of real steel grit or determination to push for another referendum. And at least the one thing about Alba is they're turning around and saying, well, do you know what, it's a de facto referendum, the Scottish Parliament election. It's the only thing that I've heard where somebody's actually produced an idea to say this is how we achieve it.
Well, here's a question for both of you. If you wanted to find out about a route to independence, would you go to the SNP or would you go to Alba to ask that question?
There you go, Jamie.
So,
on the spot.
I don't think the SNP know what the route to independence is.
I
or
agree.
Now I wonder if they want to know.
And I agree with that too.
I agree with that.
I think if I wanted independence now, then I think Alba seem more serious. I don't. But having said that, I'm not convinced that it's going to happen anytime soon. I'm not convinced that Alba has the political support. I think Alba got off on the wrong foot. I like the concept of
plebiscite.
I like the concept of understanding how the Scottish Parliament works, understanding how the list works, and voting strategically. Yeah. And I think that's what the electorate are starting to do. But I don't see independence being a issue at the next Scottish Parliament elections next year.
The conversations that we were having with Hannah Roger last week as well, that's kind of where my belief is at the moment, that they became a management party. That's what it is. We're the government, and again it's to maintain the status quo, us continuing in that position of government. And I think that, and especially Hamilton, in relation to where Katie Loudon finished and what the result meant for that, people are getting fed up the idea of having a government that will pull out the independence card every time there's an election coming up, but again delivering absolutely nothing. And I think for the position of talking about the sort of proportional representation idea for the electorate, well, Alba has went on a massive campaign to try and explain that in short videos on all social media channels. And if you're looking at that and you're going, well, that's the only political party that's actually producing anything to try and make sure that the electorate is an understanding, whereas the SNP sitting back, let's maintain the status quo, as you say, robots in positions, and let's maintain that, because ultimately we want to retain the power, the high expenses, the high office salaries.
So I mean, these are all the things that ensnare politics and politicians. Because you have these paid positions, there's structures that exist, there's constituency offices, there's jobs in the Parliament, but who really wants to give them up and surrender them for this ethereal independence that may or may not come? And I think there's been discussion over a number of years about the never-endums, and I think people have just wearied with that. And I have to say that I am. I mean, I'm for independence, generally speaking.
Was that breaking news?
No, it's not.
Is that an exclusive?
I'm for independence, but we follow politics really closely, as you do, and I can't see any legal structure that would allow Scotland to declare its independence one way or another, unless it went through the referendum process, which they're not going to get. They've had majority, super majority.
Keir Starmer's refused that again. I think it was only this week.
Absolutely. So, what's the point?
I think it goes back to Jamie's point. I think that if it's a case that you have an internal party structure that's tapping people on the shoulder in relation to candidacies, you're the person for standing here, you're the person for standing. Where's the talent? Where does the talent come from? Because those people who can think, here we can see an opportunity here to push this through, well, you and I both know within the SNP, even when at a Scottish Government level, these individuals are handpicked. And when they're
apart from the ones that went to Shetland.
Well, again, the good thing
sent away out of the way.
The good thing is I've always made reference to the fact, you look at the SNP's hierarchy, that's the Glasgow University Debating Society. That's basically what that is.
That's exactly.
So again,
that's not to say they're not intelligent people.
Not at all. But again, it comes to that idea again, is those individuals. I can think of 3 MSPs and this authority that were all part of that debating society. And again, again, it's whether or not they have the talent. If they really have the will, they'll make it happen. But the reality is there enough talent there to identify the sort of road to travel in regards to an independence referendum? I just don't think it's in existence.
Well, what I think we're missing in politics, in Scotland and in the UK more broadly, is ambition and leadership. Yeah. That we've lost any idea of strategic ambition. Yeah. And I think we won't diagnose what the challenges are. Yeah. And there's a million challenges that we mentioned earlier: justice system, healthcare system, social security system, everything across the board. But we're not diagnosing what the problems are, and we all know what they are, but there's no one offering solutions. And again, to come back to reform, they're shaking the tree, I think, and I think that's very interesting. I think that's what people are finding attractive about them, is that they somehow were speaking about the problems when no one else is. But I don't see anyone in politics who's got ambition for the for the country and going in any direction, whether we are remaining in the UK. But I do think the constitutional question is finished for quite. Do you think as a society we're scared to talk about these significant issues, and it's a case that I don't think as a society we are. I think you sit in the hospital waiting room, everyone's talking about it. But I think in politics we won't have political class won't have it, won't discuss it, and that's a real frustration, that you can't have an open debate without people being defensive.
Do you know where they should come? And I'm not joking, right? They should go down to any bowling club and a Friday night.
They're the Lanarkshire coming out. A bowling club. A bowling club for those listening.
After the Friday night.
A bowling club.
After the Friday night league's finished.
My goodness, I'm having to correct somebody's articulation. I never thought that would ever happen.
They're in having their pie and brown sauce and pancakes and all the rest of it. Yeah. Then you get debate. That's when the real
you can't engage in debate, but that's the issue. Remember, as I said again, I think that the SNP is in that unfortunate position where it becomes bloated as a government and it's no longer interested in discourse or debate. I think that's the problem. Even if we use an example in North Lanarkshire, the Labour Party's been in control of North Lanarkshire Council forever. So again, how much debate do you have with North Lanarkshire Council's leader, Lord Provost, all the rest of them are even members of the chamber?
Chair. Yeah, I want to raise Standing Order 50. I'll second that. I'll third that.
So again, I'm going to come back, Jamie, because I'm fascinated with somebody that's had foots in both camps. I've never had another political party in my life other than the SNP until I created Progressive Change along with my colleagues. But the position is again, having that, how do you see the internal selection process? Because you were a convener for the SNP up in Motherwell. Yep. How do you see the internal selection processes differ? Because you've got a unique perspective. You get to see how both parties would identify talent and push that forward, even although...
Initially I thought the SNP was fairer than the Labour Party in the selection, because in the Labour Party you had to actively vote to deselect your existing MP. And then once they were deselected, you then went round the process of who we're going to select. In the SNP, the process appeared to be much fairer. Initially, where you can kind of stand against an existing member. So at first, I thought the SNP were fairer. I think after the referendum, when the SNP had that influx of membership, I wondered then if the SNP were a meritocracy, to the extent that there were lots of people with broader backgrounds outside of politics. There were people who were very capable in their own fields, were selected into politics. But then, well, I don't know what happened to them all. We can go through them one by one. But those people all kind of fell away, as it were, or maybe pushed away. I don't know.
In our branch, I was in the Bellshill and Uddingston branch, and I joined at the referendum. Okay, and one former councillor in Hollytown was also a big David Baird.
Oh, right.
And he was a member of the branch. And what David's idea was to go around all of the new members and gather their history, their skill set,
skills audit,
right? Yeah. And it was to try and see where these new members could be fitted in. It was snuffed out. it was snuffed out.
I'll
All
tell
the
you a
paperwork
cracker.
came in,
I'll
and
tell
I'm
you a
sitting there
cracker.
patiently waiting on somebody to say, well, Jerry, your background's housing,
Yeah.
health and social
Yeah.
care. Here's where we want this to be your primary focus. Go gather all the key areas that we need to be talking about. None of that happened. And I just thought, do you know what? Either something's accidentally happened to that, or somebody doesn't want that to happen because it's a threat to those who are in key positions within the branch itself.
So within the SNP, when we were elected in 2017, obviously we're coming on the back Labour controlled council. The first time the SNP's properly challenged Labour in North Lanarkshire, and I think it's went for like 15 SNP members to all of a sudden jumping up into the 30s. And I remember that one of the first things that a so-called business manager tried to conduct at that time was a skills audit, which was absolutely hilarious, because you're looking at it and you're going, right, okay, let's start the skills audit, let's fill it in appropriately, level of qualifications for others, etc., all coming in. And about 3 or 4 weeks later you're looking and going, what did you do with that skills audit? I haven't even looked at it yet. And you're going, well, what are you potentially going to do? Oh, we don't know. And I remember at the time, because I had quite an extensive CV, and then I started laughing. They turned around and says, you can be in charge of being the spokesperson for cleansing. And I'm looking and I'm going, I know absolutely nothing about cleansing. That's not my background. Very bizarre how they decide to operate things. Very, very bizarre.
Indeed.
But anyway, Jamie, we are running out of time. That is literally, we've got about 10 minutes left with you. So we want to get through a few more questions, if that's okay. So based on your background, do you think there's a risk that strong, independent voices, such as Jerry and I's, potentially within the party structure could be seen as a threat to those in positions of power?
Yes, undoubtedly.
Yeah.
I think the independent mind has gone from politics and most of the mainstream parties. It's very hard to disagree. Hard to disagree at the best of times and go against the crowd.
Yeah.
Often I've found when I go against the crowd, I generally I'm saying I'm right. But you look at some of the major decisions. The Labour Party's approach to independence at the time, the Iraq War, all these kind of constant issues, gender, before we touch on that, in Scotland. So it's very hard to go against the crowd. It's even harder to do so, I think, in a political party. And it's very hard. We take Scotland alone, where there's a list structure and there's more and more control over party selections, over listings, over candidate vetting. But I don't think the parties like an independent mind. I think the public do. But the political parties don't. There's no space for independent thinking.
That point that you made there about proportional representation, the list. So of the 129 seats in the Scottish Parliament, 73 are fought over first past the post, and the rest are on the list. And on the list, you don't really campaign. Your name's just on the list. You can campaign if you want, but your name just goes on the list.
Vote for the party as opposed to a name.
And your reward, perhaps for being a good robot rather than a bad robot, Greg, is that because you're on the list and you've worked your way through the robot world, then you'll be propelled into being an MSP. You've done nothing. You're not necessarily well known, but you've oiled the wheels enough to get you a career in politics. So absolutely nothing to do with merit, and all to do with who you knew and what you did, and off you go. So in a sense, the PR element, which everybody speaks about being a really healthy approach to politics, and for a while, and I'm still a wee bit conflicted on it, I'll be perfectly honest, because I like elements of proportional representation. I think parliaments that proportionally represent your community, your country, the area that you live is a good thing. But if it's simply to reward people who probably don't, who shouldn't be there, I think it's counterproductive.
There's an interesting model in Scandinavia as to how some of their list systems work, where there are national lists and the voters can pick from the part. They go to the part of the one, and then they pick from the list. I think that's a really interesting model, because I think parties could be using lists, and I hear talk from some parties about the intention of doing this. They use the lists to pick the people that they think will best represent the party and best represent the electorate, and put them put them on the list. 'Cause the geography can be hit and miss. You can have a great candidate, but you're in an area where the party doesn't get votes, for instance. But I think there's real problems with how we view the lists and how they're operated.
You might know your list MP or MPs because you have an interest in politics, but I guarantee you, if we stopped 10 people out there, or 10 people in Carfin, and we asked them to name any of their list MSPs that would be on it.
I had reason to write to my MSPs. I wrote to my constituents MSP and all the list MSPs, and I got one response, and the only response was from the constituency.
There you go.
MSP. She responded well, she responded quickly. But the list MSPs, none of them responded to my.
And some of them are running. I mean, some of them have already announced their candidacy to run now as constituency MPs, believing that they've acquired the kudos through their years in the Parliament to do so.
I think it comes back to the idea of talent. Again, I can give an example with my own constituency MSP. When contributions were being made in the Scottish Parliament, it would always start off by, I was jogging by this bit, or I was running past that on my daily run, and you're looking at it, you're going, you should be in your constituency. I don't want to see you running past it. I want to see you stopping and engaging with people and asking, how can I fix that problem? It seems to be that we've lost this element of wanting to actually talk to people and stand there and be held accountable. It's a very, very strange political bubble.
That accountability issue is an important one, because when you see the public angry or wanting to be quite direct, there's often the public don't put it in a nice, lawyerly, subtle manner. But I think many politicians are now scared of that, saying, don't want to deal with aggressive members of the public. There are issues on that front, but I think we're losing engagement with the public, losing the ability to disagree.
If you look at, again, I'm going to go back to the Hamilton by-election when it was a debate night, and we covered that last week, Jerry. But what we never covered was the two main candidates that participated in that debate. Katie Loudon was being interviewed, and I think Colin Mackay posed the question in regards to the NHS, do you owe the people an apology? And it was like party line, divert. Why are we not honest anymore? That's the part that I really don't know. Listen, do you know what? Yep, probably we've got it wrong and we're trying to work and we're trying to fix it. I think people would find that more appealing, as opposed to, do you know what? No, I'm not even going to approach it or acknowledge that subject matter. I just find it rather bizarre.
I think it's refreshing to hear people speak their mind. And again, you look at that by-election. So looking as a am I a neutral observer? Maybe I'm not. But close to a quarter of the electorate voted for the new guys on the block who are coming in, saying what they see, saying what they think, and whether you agree with them or disagree with them, their approach seems to work. They went from nowhere to a quarter of the vote. The push Labour into second place.
I think the danger for the SNP moving forward with regards to the rise of reform is how they place or frame the electorate that is voting for reform. I think that if they take a sort of an above perspective their politics, I think that's going to come back to bite them. I think it's going to come back to bite them.
Yep.
I think that's right, and I think we've lost respect. Now people would say that to me, everyone's aggressive who doesn't respect me, but I think we've lost respect to the extent that we can sit and we can have a really firm disagreement. We can have a really heated discussion and then leave it at that. I think we've lost that in politics.
I think we've lost it even in common parlance. Anyone who has a firm view on anything is either viewed as anti or pro. There's no
silos, it's deliberate silo creation.
There's no nuance to it, as you spoke about earlier on, and I think that's impacting on our political discourse.
It's not good for society more broadly. And to go back to where we started, you say, well, why are people not going into politics? You think, well, who would want to go into politics? Who would want to go into politics now?
Idiots like Greg and I.
It's a much harder sell for people now, I think.
And it's needed more than ever. What's needed more than ever is people with a voice, people with character, people with courage, and people with the life experience to articulate that in a way that I don't think
I
it's
just
been
think we've
properly
lost
done.
the orators. I think we've lost the people that can stand up on behalf of the constituents that elected them and says, look, listen, this is your opinion. This is where we stand. It seems as if the party machinery has overtaken everything, in my opinion. It's took away any individuality within the party, because anybody at all that demonstrates either an element of creativity with regards to how they look at things and look at the world, then all of a sudden they're slapped down, put in a box, and then it's up to them whether the frustrations are allowed to chase them out.
I think that's a problem. I think you look at some of the recent debates in the Scottish Parliament on divisive issues.
Yeah.
So you take
Yeah.
is it the assisted suicide bill, or whatever
yeah.
it's called? Yeah. You take assisted suicide. That's a controversial issue. There's a divide, but there's almost the Parliament's unanimous. So you think, well, where's the diversity of thought? There's no diversity of thought amongst the mainstream parties, and then within the parties they discourage diversity of thought. But I think diversity of thought is what makes us stronger, being able to say what you think, having the courage to say what you think, and being respected for what you think. But being able to focus on what joins you together. And I think we're seeing the impact of that now in the rise of the Reform, quite frankly, where they are the ones pushing through this. They're coming with a slightly different messaging, and they're shaking the tree, breaking the consensus. And I think the other parties, the Conservatives, the Labour Party and the SNP, have to think very carefully about how they treat the electorate, and how they treat politics more broadly.
Do you think Miss Le Pen will be coming over here to give them some tips on how to get it done?
Well, I think
because if that approach is adopted, it's going to be viewed by many as a real shift to the right, whether it is or not.
But if you look at some of the results, like the Central Belt results, like Clydebank, even North East, the council by-election, not the Glasgow North East, I think they took close to 20% from a standing start. This is the first time a party on the centre-right has taken a quarter of the vote in Central Belt seats since probably the 1950s.
Our curiosity lies in North Lanarkshire. How did they convert that Labour traditional heartland? And is that something that we're going to see? Because obviously the Tories are going to collapse, in my opinion. Not be dead, but they'll collapse in Scotland.
They'll become reform.
They'll become reform. That's basically, we're already hearing just now that Conservatives in North Lanarkshire are already in discussions with reform about jumping ship.
But you look at one of the latest reform defections, a young Labour councillor from Renfrewshire, solid Labour working class background. You look at what's happened in England. It's the kind of It's the Labour heartlands that went to the Conservatives under Boris have now had enough. But it's a failure on the part of what we call the mainstream parties. It's their failure. That's
the establishment. I would agree with that.
And I don't think you can blame.
No,
you can't blame people because if you look at the trends, people in the US, we all look to Obama to give us hope. He didn't deliver anything. And then here we look to the SNP after the referendum, voting yes or for change, something different. Never got anything out of that. So now it's probably the last roll of the dice for the electorate to say, well, let's see what this delivers. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens next year in the Scottish Parliament election.
Jamie Kerr, that's your time. Thank you so much for joining us. Honestly, it's been an absolute pleasure. I would sit here all night and just chew the fat with you. Honestly, I think that for your position, it's actually interesting to gain insight into a subject matter and coming for an expert.
I got his card as well. I've got his.
As I say, I need to sit with Jerry.
Get my fee note next.
I need to sit with Jerry. But anyway, before we kind of cut for a wee break, Jerry, just to let the good folk at home know, we'll be coming to our phone-in section when we come back after these couple of songs, and in addition to that, we're joined by a very special guest. I don't know if we should name who it is at the moment, but
keep the guest.
We'll keep the guest secret. We'll keep it secret at the moment. But ladies and gentlemen, we'll be back in a minute after these couple of songs. Thank you. Hello and welcome back to What's the Point? Well, Jerry, we've just had Jamie Kerr leave the building and talk about two songs. One's a bit of Pretender and the other one's about Toxic, and then our good pal comes in, David Crichton, to talk about North Lanarkshire. How are we, David?
I am absolutely fantastic. Great to be here and offer you guys some coaching and mentoring skills that you quite clearly need.
It has been a while, fella.
And
It's been a
the
while.
warm-up act is left, so thanks for that, Jamie.
Do you know, Jamie proved to be a highly intellectual individual.
And then we
Greg.
settled
I know
for
what's
this.
coming next.
And
Yeah,
now
okay.
David
For
comes
this.
in
I know.
to take the man's seat.
To bring balance to the whole thing.
For the good folks at home that don't know what we're even talking about, and it just sounds as if we're slagging a guest coming onto the show. David is a very, very good friend of ours. He's a member of our political grouping, but also in addition to that, you were one of the very first guests and presenters on the podcast many, many moons ago, until your wife started keeping you in.
Well, I thought I just failed the audition and you went with the bells of hell bowler, but that was...
No, it was touch and go. There was a bribe involved in it.
That's it, exactly. So thank you very much for giving up your Tuesday evening.
More than welcome.
We will be going to a calls section, so hopefully we'll have a few callers coming in, and just to let folk know that you can give us a wee call. I don't have the number handy, it's on my social media channels now, but feel free to give us a call with any questions that you may have. In addition to that as well, David, what I want to kind of talk to you about, and where I want us to try and focus, is in the current political landscape in relation to North Lanarkshire. So we had Jamie, and Jamie gave us wonderful insight on what it means to stand as a Labour candidate and what that means. So from our perspective, what we've always thought happened has kind of been confirmed, that people just get tapped on the shoulder and get asked to stand in certain areas, and whether or no you're the talent or not, it's either a reward or recognition or whatever it may be for you to proceed forward.
Yep.
What's your thoughts on that? Is it similar to the way it works in the SNP?
Well, I suppose to a certain extent, and probably it's borne fruit more recently with the candidacy stuff that we were talking about for the 2026 selection for candidates for SNP, that we're aware of kind of people that are working for MSPs already, trying to make their way through. So that this hierarchy and kind of nepotism, if that's the word for it, that's there, is evident. And I think I was listening to Jamie on the way up actually, Jamie made it quite clear, it seems to be across all parties, or most parties that's there. So can real talent or different talent break through into that when it's already a kind of sealed unit? I'm not so sure, I'll be honest.
I think it's essential. I think it's essential. I think people have spoken over generations about being fed up with politicians and politicians saying the same things all the time. When you investigate that, it's probably not as true as you might think. You might not have liked what they wanted to say, but when you had people who were happy to speak out, the likes of, whether you liked it or not, Thatcher had a particular approach, right? Michael Foot had a particular approach. Even Neil Kinnock, to an extent, had a particular approach. Ted Heath, others before them, but they were happy to speak out and say things that you might not like. And I find at the moment that that's not quite the case. There's not enough dissenting voices are happy to come up with an alternative.
Do you think you have dissenting voices in North Lanarkshire? But and again, for the good folks at home, the 3 years are sitting councillors. We participate in local democracy, especially within the civic, all the time. Who do you see within the chamber who break away from conformity, that will stand against whatever the party's view is, to stand up for electorate? I don't see that anymore. You're talking about the days of the orators that is gone now. There's nobody prepared to stand in that chamber.
Look, there's very few people, let's be fair, there's 77 councillors
77
that go to these full council meetings in chamber, and that's 3 years that I've been there, and I would think that there is only 15-20% of councillors that have ever spoken at these meetings. So how can they hand
What
on
do you
heart
mean
say,
ever spoken?
well, ever offered a comment, ever asked a question?
Or a full council? How many would you say?
Honestly, I'd estimate about 15% of the...
I would raise it higher than that.
There'd be 20-ish.
There's one individual
In
that
full
I
council?
have never heard speak. I've never heard them speak, either at a committee, a working group, or full council.
Oh, there are
absolutely
many.
no contribution.
There are many like that.
No, I was going to say, within the SNP group, I could name you about
numbers
5 or 10 right
Yeah.
now.
I didn't want to name any names.
No, but within the groups, even Labour and the Conservatives, even there's a couple of the Conservatives that I think that's
You
very,
look
very
at some
quiet.
of the hot topics. I mean, if you go back to what, dare I say, there was one, you talk about budget, you talk about allocation of huge contracts and we went through the Mere situation that's there. We were
Big talking point last week with Hannah Roger.
Absolutely, and I listened to that as well. And yet there was not one Labour councillor who's in the administration asked a question about the whole aspect
I'm going to play
Mears.
devil's
And you
advocate
just think,
on that. And perhaps because they are the administration, they're getting private briefings. So perhaps they don't need to ask any questions because their questions
They're
have
satisfied.
already they're satisfied, yeah.
No, but they do, because they have to represent. See, this is where I think it's different, is that the hierarchy that we're talking about that's there is that it's filling the room with people that have come through party politics. They're not necessarily representing the people that elected them to be there. So the people, and the difference is that people want the elected ones that they've put their cross in the box for to actually speak up, be controversial, make a point, and actually answer a question. Somebody asks you a question that's a yes or no answer, then give them a yes or no answer. Yeah. And I think if we start to do that, people will start to engage.
I think there's a couple of things. I think one, we're looking at it nationally in relation to the standard of the politicians that are being selected, and I think that's a false premise for us because we're talking about North Lanarkshire, and again coming back to it with our El Presidente and El Dictorium. El Dictorium. Again, is it a case that anybody at all, because the selection processes that exist within North Lanarkshire, is anybody coming forward who actually does know about stuff? Now again, coming back to that point, 5 or 6 in the chamber, I could say, do you know what, they know their brief. But
our good viewers, right, are going to have an opportunity on the 19th of June to tune in at 4 o'clock
to look at the standard
and watch it. So there's your invitation. Have your tea early. Tune in at 4 o'clock and witness what North Lanarkshire has to offer in terms of
or even go back and look at some of the webcast, because these meetings are all recorded and stored obviously on the website. So go back and look at some of the big meetings and see the lack of representation that's made across the chamber. And
interesting to see what actually comes through. I mean, we've spoken about this before. There'll be topics on the agenda that have been selected for discussion, and they may well be matters of import, right? For councillors, though, if we wish to effect changes, it comes through the motions and the amendments to those motions. And we'll have an opportunity to look and see what the quality of those motions are.
No, it's not even looking at that. I think we need to be honest as well. If you're shutting down discourse and debate through a gatekeeper, which is the Lord Provost, the North Lanarkshire Council, then he decides what motions proceed and what motions don't proceed, regardless of explanation.
One individual,
again, closed door meeting, and again the issue here is how do the good people of North Lanarkshire get to actually see anybody at all making representation in their behalf via a motion function?
Well, you'll know that one of the motions that I'd put forward, that this is the third time we're trying to get the same motion through.
I'm running out of fingers for the motions that I get.
I think we all became the Lord Provost best pen pal.
I get fed up writing them, because I know when I write the motions and I put them in, I'm going to get exactly the same response back. And unfortunately, whether that Lord Provost acts in this impartial role when he's chairing the full council meetings, but at the bottom line, he's a Labour councillor.
Can he be? I'm going to cause a wee bit of controversy here. Can he be unbiased? Because if you look at the Environment and Transportation Committee, where he said members of PCNL will see that they have no influence over any other group, independent or other, in this council, that doesn't sound unbiased. So is there a distinction here then? And I'm trying to play the devil's advocate for him. I'm only trying to lambast him. But the position is that when he's a councillor, he can say whatever he wishes, and then when he's Lord Provost, he's to be extremely neutral.
That's exactly the problem. How do you divorce that? How can you make these kind of comments in full council? Which is fine, they're political comments and they're aimed at another political group. But then how do you divorce that when you sit in the Provost chair and you get motions put forward by the very political group that you've lambasted in the committee before? So is there bias? There's a natural tendency or bias to look at these things, and I would think it's an exceptionally difficult thing not to. And I just know the list, and collectively the list of motions that we have put forward that have all been rejected, every one of them.
I put forward one for this council that's been rejected, and I've copied. I think I've copied you in a few of the emails, right? What has happened in my motion that's been refused more than once is an attempt to conflate what I'm asking for with something else.
Yeah.
And without that conflation, the motion, as
Goes
I see
forward.
it must go forward.
Correct.
But you need to create a reason to say no. So you must create this conflation that a review is the same as a change, when it's just not. The Oxford Dictionary makes it quite clear, and that's used as a means to shut down that.
Do you think
debate.
we need to get Jamie back on and ask him legal advice?
I think well, we should have asked him.
We should ask him these questions. We'll get him back on. We'll be asking him, posing them the questions.
I don't think that's such a bad idea.
I don't think that's a bad idea either.
But when we go through that process,
Yeah.
not to mention any officer who's doing their job and responding, but when we submit motions to be considered by the provost will respond through the legal and democratic services team, and the head of that is a solicitor. So it's almost as if there's legal advice has been taken on this motion. The legal advice is that it doesn't meet standing orders, and therefore that's a qualification. But we don't really know whether those discussions have been had.
Do we feel in North Lanarkshire, because obviously we spoke, Jerry, this evening about Hamilton by-elections and all this kind of stuff, and I think that general apathy is across the board, general feeling is across the board. People are looking legitimately for change, whatever that change may be. It'll be entirely up to them. But do we have a sense or a feeling in North Lanarkshire people are just fed up with the way North Lanarkshire Council is run and operated under the current administration? And to be honest, by the way, I think that we've been pretty scathing in episodes in relation to Labour and the SNP. There's one group that gets away with it all the time, in my opinion, because we always forget about them, is the Tories. They are part coalition partners.
The proper uppers.
Yeah, the proper uppers. They're the coalition partners to this Labour administration. And again, should we be focusing more on them? Because audit and scrutiny and all these other lovely committees all sit within their remit.
I think you might be hitting on something there, Greg, I have to say.
You've got to look at the basis of why would you introduce payments towards people within a rival political group? Are we actually saying that Labour don't have the talent within their own
I've
group
asked that question
to hold committee convenerships?
Yeah.
And I don't think that's the
How
case.
does it feel we've got a Labour member sitting in that group? I would be absolutely furious.
Well, there's a couple of Labour members that I know, and they've already spoken and spoken to me privately and said, honestly, they are hacked off at the base, and they could see why it's getting done. You know, that if you put people within certain positions in committees or outside bodies and receiving additional payments to their salary, then it becomes very difficult to vote against the administration. Now, that's not always the case. They might.
Their argument would be when it came to the brown bin charge. Was it a brown bin charges or was it? It was something, I can't remember what it was, within the housing committee. And the review of one-stop shops.
Yeah,
so
the cash payments.
Yeah,
like that.
and that was the first time they compensated a motion with the SNP, so the two of them had to come together and then challenge Labour. Now I'm playing devil's advocate again. Is it a case that they're there to hold power account, or is it a case that we'll do that once in a blue moon and then we'll accept the payment thereafter?
How are you any good at spelling?
Go.
How do you spell facade?
Facade.
But there is this facade of this creation of debate that goes on in the chamber. It doesn't really.
That's a lot of nonsense. It's a game.
But we talk about it as theatre, and it normally happens every budget. It didn't happen this budget. Funnily enough, there was no 15-minute break for the Labour group to go away. They just come straight there. So all the deals had been done. But normally we've got that wee 15-minute ice cream break where we go.
Here's a question for you, right? And this is a legitimate question. Given the rise of reform across Scotland, right? So we're going to see them coming to North Lanarkshire one way or another. Now, when it comes to the local elections, potentially Scottish Government elections next year, and I'm being speculative here. Now, with the rise of that party, potentially it'll be the status quo in relation to the SNP, but you can see there's a number of councillors within both the SNP and Labour are ageing, and potentially the Conservatives certain individuals. I think the leaders are in retirement age already and things like that. What does the future of Labour look like if it's a case that the current leader stands down? Who? Let's be speculative. Let's look at who potentially could take that El Presidente title.
Jerry.
Do you think? What happens? What happens if that individual retires? Because I tell you right now, it's careful what you wish for, because where's the talent within the Labour group that's going to be able to come forward and take on that role? We haven't
ran the numbers yet on the council elections, because we've kind of been focusing on the Holyrood elections rather than 2027 for the council elections. But if that 25 to 30% carries through, as it looks as if it may, then the numbers, the balance in North Lanarkshire Council looks very, very different from what it is now. So
does Labour sell out and do what it did when it done its deal with the Tories and do a deal with Reform for an administration block, or is it a case that we'll have to go cap in hand to the SNP and try and get the SNP?
I think they'll go cap in hand to the Reform.
To Reform?
Yeah.
Do you think so?
Oh, without doubt. Without doubt.
That's a bold statement. I think somebody will be reliant on how the 2026 Holyrood elections go, and the impact that Reform maybe have there will determine what associations or alliances might come in 2027. Because the shape of North Lanarkshire will change after that.
I think we're still in a binary arrangement. I still think we're looking at unionist and nationalist.
I don't think so. I don't think so anymore.
I think we might be. I think if you're minded to be strong on the union, I think you will vote either Reform or Labour in North Lanarkshire.
You need a clear strategy coming forward for the SNP. You need something. The SNP is not going to be in a position to present that. Potentially they'll present another independence referendum but give no route map. But the reality is the electorate's going to decide, like Jamie said, potentially now is not really where people's thoughts and feelings are. It might be about what's in my pocket and how much I'm spending. Brown bidding charges, again, an extra 40 quid a year that's coming out your pocket that you never accounted for. So these kind of things are going to impact in relation to how people are voting in North Lanarkshire. My question again, speculatively, because let's not kid on, we don't have a crystal ball, but we do have a good understanding of where the political dice might fall. Is it a case that if, let's say, El Presidente retires? Because, again, is it going to cling on to power the way it's clung on to power the last two terms?
You might have Colonel McBride.
Well, again, this is the question. The question is really, in effect, if Reform does return elected members, potentially independents are affected in this, because they could be drowned out the water. Is it a case that we're going to see a coalition between, given the fact that Labour would never work with the Tories, never do a deal with the Tories, but in North Lanarkshire that relationship has been extremely healthy over the years? Do we think that potentially a Reform coalition with Labour? I'm going to keep dwelling on that point.
I think it will depend on how many Tory councillors are returned. That's the first thing. So I think there's a problem there. I mean, there's a few good people in that group as well, but the whole thing will have shifted by then. 2027, we're talking about 2 years away. So we've already seen Reform get a foothold, as they would term it, in Hamilton. I think you're right to a point, Jerry, is that there is still this unionist nationalist thing within Chamber. There shouldn't be, because I think that's the last thing people want. I think people just want individuals to stand up and make a voice. And that's why they're fed up. They're not fed up with politics. They're fed up with the fact the games behind it. And I know you're desperate to get in, but the bottom line is that regardless, Labour will make a deal with whoever it takes to make sure that they're still there.
That's the point I'm trying to get to.
They must.
But here's the issue, again, coming back to that constitutional debate that's absolutely farcical that exists within North Lanarkshire. Again, those debates, in my opinion, are clearly there because you've nothing else to talk about, because you can't get any deep and meaningful in relation to housing or this or that and the next thing, because the majority of your members haven't got a clue what you're talking about. So let's keep the constitutional tribal politics on the go.
There's another thing as well, and it goes back to things like the Mears contract, right? Big issues like Mears and how you organise your local authority, how you deliver services. We were having a chat about this the other day. that Mears contract going through for anyone who had any machinations or any hopes that North Lanarkshire Council could develop some kind of DLO or arm's length organisation where they would deliver the services that Mears deliver. They can't look at that for 8 to 12
years. That's right.
So you put that contract into context. 12 years of what we've got, that becomes your that's institutionalised.
You've just opened up a whole new topic, and by the way, we're running out of time. Just to be aware, but I do think this is something that we
so really worry. I worry about that, and I do so genuinely.
Is the political groupings manifestos in North Lanarkshire, because part of the SNP's manifesto pledges was the DLO.
Yeah.
So, and for those at home, that's an internal repair service and things like that, so that those people know and understand what that is. The SNP had highlighted front and centre that they would return home repairs, home improvements, all the rest of it back to North Lanarkshire. But yet that we ended up in a position where a £1.8 billion contract went out to tender. It's really strange.
To one company.
Wow.
Well, it didn't go out to tender because we had chief officers in that final meeting that basically said we have no alternative but to accept this.
Yeah.
What a sad indictment that is.
Yeah.
That we're going to award a contract for 12 years.
From an SNP's perspective, taking that administration, now granted whatever turbulence came at the back of how that transitioned administration. But the reality of the situation is that work should have been well underway within the 8 weeks because it was part of a manifesto pledge.
Greg,
Surely you would think that DLO would have still featured as a plausible option.
Well, we now know that it can't, but we also know that particular contractor who won the contract and now delivers that repair service, there's other roles for that organisation within the council as well, in terms of its involvement in elections, council elections.
Well, you mean the ballot boxes and bringing
all of that. So mayors are involved in all of that, all of those governance structures, all of those democratic structures from very top to the very bottom. Embeds them in our local politics and governance potentially for the next 12 years. And because of that length of time, a number of the officers who were there, who may well have been favourable towards a DLO or an ALIO, or potentially they're all gone.
Where's South Lanarkshire go?
I wouldn't like to say because I don't know. I can't say.
That's something for us to look into.
But it's
a bit curious one in relation to who operated that in South Lanarkshire.
I hadn't given any consideration to what the SNP manifesto looked like, but I do remember prominent members of the SNP group being told that the DLO or the arm's length DLO was being seriously considered, and I don't see any possibility of that happening. So it'll be interesting to see whether that features in any manifestos going forward.
Well, on that note, gents, that's us came to an end. Davy Crichton, thank you very much for coming in.
You're more than welcome.
Having a blairer with us. Jerry Brennan,
I wouldn't mind seeing him back, Greg.
Will we get him back? I don't know.
Is that you giving up your seat?
David, I would give it up to you. No, I wouldn't give it up to many, but I'd give it up to you.
He's hungry, this guy. He's hungry.
Jerry is.
Oh, you?
Oh, I don't think that applies at all. But I've got to go just before he goes. That a joint friend of ours, Tom, I'm just going to say Tom, wants to set aside your assertion of this Belsey Hill bowler.
Oh,
because he's nowhere near a bowler, according to this joint.
Always a Belsey Hill bowler.
So I think we need to find a different name for Councillor Brennan sitting here.
It's not for me to be singing about my credentials. I'll just let my talents with degrees speak for themselves.
Well, anyway, you've been listening to What's the Point. We hope you've found it informative and engaging as always. Next week we'll have another guest on. Maybe I'd try and get you back, David, just to come in for a blairer to chew the fat.
Yep, absolutely.
And in addition to that as well, we'll be launching all the usual stuff on the podcast on Thursday. In the meantime, if you want to keep the debate ongoing, you can go to our social media channels and highlight any aspect. And all we've got to say is thank you very much
for joining us.
Listening and joining us.
Night, folks.
See you next week.
Thank you.